Well, guys, I am so glad you're here. We are in the middle of a series called How I Met My Savior. And what we've been doing is we're actually looking at developing a Christian worldview. We're trying to understand how the world is in reality based on what the Bible says. Because we want to be able to take the biblical truths and put them into practice in our day-to-day walk. And so we started out talking about some different aspects of a Christian worldview. And we've discussed some of the things that are out there. We've looked at other worldviews. You remember one week we talked about atheism and pantheism. And you'll remember the two differences. Pantheism basically is the belief that of multiple gods, or that your God, your God. And then atheism believes there is no God. And that theism believes that God is personal, and that's where Christianity falls. Now, understand, not all theism is Christianity, okay? And what we're trying to show you is that you can't say there are multiple paths to God. And remember, we talked about the first week, what is truth? And we explored a great deal of what each of the groups say truth is. And we finally came to the conclusion that what Jesus said was this: I am the way and the truth and the life, and no man comes to the Father but by me. And so the reality is that we think, the truth is that truth is what we believe, or the truth is this, or the truth is that, but truth is somebody, and his name is Jesus Christ. And ultimately, when we stop to examine that, we know what truth is. Truth is somebody. It is not something. The truth is Jesus Christ. And the truth is that he is the only way and the only truth and the only way to the Father. He is the way and the truth and the life, and no man comes to the Father but by me. So there's not multiple paths. They're mutually exclusive. An atheist would not say, okay, well, there's multiple ways to believe here. You can either believe in Jesus or you cannot believe in it. No, they believe there is no God. That they're mutually exclusive to anyone who believes in God at all. So we talked about atheism, we talked about pantheism, we've talked a little bit about theism, and we've talked about what truth is. Well, tonight I want to look kind of at a case for God. Now, this is not going to be, I'm not going to drag out his driver's license and pull out his passport and say, okay, here he is, it proves there's a God. Okay? But what we're going to do is we're going to look at the evidence. We're going to look at the evidence for who God is. Now, I know some atheists they're going to say, well, or agnostics, that the case is really weak, and that the case against God is very strong. And it's open and shut. But see, there really isn't an open shut case here. It's just they failed to recognize the evidence. There are two gentlemen who set out to prove that Christianity was bogus. That Jesus never really existed and Jesus never really died on the cross. One of them was a guy named Josh McDowell. And he actually set out and ended up writing a book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And he laid out all the evidence, and when he got to the end of the book, he started out as an atheist and ended up proving the truth of Christianity. The other guy is a guy named Lee Strobel. Now, Lee Strobel used to be a journalist, and he was an atheist. His wife became a Christian, and he decided he was going to sit down and prove that God did not exist, that Jesus Christ never died for our sins, that Jesus Christ never walked the face of this earth. The problem was, when he got to the end of proving, all he proved was that Jesus Christ is who he says he is, and God is who he says he is, and that we're sinners in need of a Savior. So Lee Strobel tells this story. A former journalist, he tells of a time when he's reporting of an attempted murder case of James Dixon. Here's what happened. Dixon, armed with a gun, was heard arguing with his girlfriend. The police were called, and when the police arrived, the girl's father came out but was attacked by Dixon. When the policeman tried to break it up, the policeman was shot in the chest. Just then, backup came, and they took Dixon to jail. When the case finally came to trial, the evidence was overwhelming. Dixon's gun, with all his prints all over it, was found in the bushes a short ways away. There was one bullet missing. It had been fired, and the cropped shirt had gunpowder burns showing he'd been shot at extremely close range. Dixon had a record to cap it off, and finally, he confessed that he'd shot the cop. Open and shut case, right? That would prove it, right? Here's the problem with it. 2 days after the opening statement, Strobel got a call from an informant. He spoke quietly, saying, "Word is, the officer involved had a pen gun, a .22 caliber pistol that's shaped to look like a fountain pen. It's illegal for anyone to carry, including policemen. And the policeman shot himself accidentally with his own gun in his own shirt pocket. He framed Dixon to avoid trouble of carrying an unauthorized weapon." Strobel took the tip and reopened the case. Suddenly, things no one had considered came to life. For example, before the policeman arrived, witnesses reported seeing Dixon pounding on the door with the heel of the gun. And the gun went off. And it shot in a downward direction, and there was a chip in the pavement and a bullet in the ground that nobody paid attention to. It also accounted for the bullet that was missing from the gun. And a new witness said they saw Dixon throw the gun into the bushes before the police arrived. After a little work, the powder burns on the policeman's shirt they realized was concentrated inside his shirt pocket. And finally, when pressed why he pled guilty, Dixon said he was told he had only 1 year if he pled guilty. And he'd already spent 360 days in jail waiting for trial. If he just confessed, he'd be out in a few days. But if he pled not guilty and lost, they'd throw the book at him. When this new evidence came to life, Dixon was exonerated, and the policeman who had received a Medal of Bravery for the incident was fired from the department. See, the reason I tell that story is because I wonder how many of us make assumptions about the state of evidence of some spiritual claim. We think, well, believing in Jesus is just faith. You don't have to have a brain to believe in him. You don't have to think about it. There's no evidence. But I'm here to tell you right now that there are fingerprints of God everywhere. They're all over his creation. They're all over us. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, but the reason I want you to see that, the reason I want you to understand that, is because we make assumptions about evidence when God doesn't expect us to check our brains at the door. When you become a believer, he's not saying you have to stop thinking, that you have to ignore science. No, science usually has to catch up with faith. It talks about, in the Bible, it always amazes me. The world is described as being round. There are places in the Old Testament when it talks about the globe and the circle. And wait a minute, didn't they used to believe the world was flat? Well, yeah, but the Bible said it was round all those years ago. Hold it, wait a minute, you said what? Yeah. The Bible makes claims scientifically that everybody used to think was stupid. The whole Jewish law was about germs. Part of the reason that God laid down the law he did is because the Jews didn't get sick. Turned out that a lot of the Jewish dietary laws were actually healthy. They're things that we do now because we've started to realize that all these years later that, you know what? If we follow these laws, we eat healthier. We do better. Because God designed us, you would think that God would know how our bodies react. Okay? So, remember, we said that we want a worldview that best corresponds to the evidence of the world, right? And I want to examine 3 lines of evidence that constitute the case for God. Reasons to believe God, the God is real. Okay? And so, we're not going to show irrefutable proof, but the plausibility of God given. Now, it's important that we understand that because in Romans 1, 19 and 18 to 20, it says this, "For God, holy wrath and indignation are revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who in their wickedness repress and hinder the truth and make it inoperative. For that which is known about God is evident to them and made plain in their inner consciousness, because God himself has shown it to them. For ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature and attributes, that is, the eternal power and divinity, have been made intelligible and clearly discernible in and through the things that have been made his handiworks. So men are without excuse, altogether without any defense or justification. You know what that's saying, guys? That's saying that God's fingerprints are everywhere, and he has revealed himself to the world, and so no one can say, well, I never knew. God just said there in 1920 that he's revealed himself. Our problem is that we end up deceiving ourselves by coming up with our own solutions because we don't like what God came up with. So there's a positive, we're not going, like I said, I'm not going to give you God's photograph or his driver's license or his passport photo. But what we're going to show you is that the evidence of God is much more plausible than any other explanation. And I think, to be honest, that it's more than just plausible. But I'm going to look at three things: the fine-tuning of the universe, the first cause argument, and the argument of morality. Now, when I say fine-tuning, I mean this. As it turns out, the universe we live in is extremely fine-tuned for life. Imagine someday we're exploring in space and we come across a bubble just floating there in space. And inside that bubble, there's all kinds of life forms thriving. And you're amazed because this is just a bubble floating in space by itself. But then on the side of the bubble, you see a series of knobs and dials. And you realize that each one of those dials controls some part of the environment of the bubble. There might be one for controlling the temperature, and one for controlling the barometric pressure, and one for the humidity, and one for gravity, and one for radiation, and one for the amount of light, and etc., and etc., and etc. And each dial could have a bunch of settings. So it's amazing that someone has set this biosphere up with precisely those conditions to make the life inside viable. So you would wonder to yourself, what if I tweak the knobs and dials? That's when they discover something else about those dials. You find out that moving any one of them, any amount, destroys life in the biosphere. Not only are they tuned just so to work together, any adjustment to any of them would devastate the biosphere, would end life. It would collapse and everything would die. The universe we are finding is just like that biosphere. It is finely tuned. And our universe is running precisely. And so we come across the universe and we can't make any changes, because if you make one change in any nth degree, all life ceases to exist in this universe. And so we have to come to the conclusion that there are physical laws that govern how stuff works. The universe is ordered, it has structure, it has predictability. And these laws are themselves so precise that any change in them, any change, makes life highly improbable, if not impossible. Now, you might want to know these dials on the universe. They're highly specific values for things like the gravitational constant, the velocity of light, the strong nuclear force, the mass of atomic particles, and the cosmological constant. To give you a picture of the fine-tuning, just take the last value, the cosmological constant. How much play is in there in that one dial? If it was different by 1 part in 10 to the 60th power, guys, that's 1 followed by 60 zeros, what we would see around us would not exist, and there would be no life. There is no play in that. It has to be precise for life to exist. And it seems unlikely that such a circumstance could just happen by accident. A bunch of chemicals got together and created the velocity of light? Oh, wait a minute. It can't be created, right? It just sprang into existence. It evolved on its own with nothing happening. Paul Davies says that so you get an idea of this, Paul Davies says, suppose you wanted to fire an arrow at a 1-inch target on the other side of the observable universe, 20 billion light years away. Your aim would have to be accurate to the same part in 10 to hit it. If the gravitational constant was the same way, it would mean no stars, no galaxies, no planets would form. Imagine a ruler stretched across the observable universe, and the dial is set at a point along that ruler, and you could not move that ruler at all and still have this universe. Our universe is precisely tuned. So, did it have to be that way? Well, so far we have no reason to believe that these dials couldn't be tuned all over the place. But there's no other dial controlling these dials. Could it be chance? Could it be that it was just a happy accident? Maybe if one was finely tuned, maybe all of them together balanced on a razor wire of precision could accidentally all be tuned precisely so that life could exist? So that is so unlikely that what you're left with as this universe is an intelligent design. The improbability screams out that this is designed. Look, I'm sitting at my desk right now, and I have a watch here that I wear. It's not a regular watch, it's digital. Okay? That watch was created and built by somebody. Okay? It did not miraculously explode and appear on my desk one day. Any more than my car miraculously exploded and appeared on my desk one day. My car doesn't on my desk, so it's not likely it's going to appear, but it's not going to appear out front. Any more than my computer. Any more than the air we breathe, the ground we walk on. It is so improbable, the odds are absolutely astronomically ridiculous to believe that it had just happened unless someone designed it. Now, the first way that a lot of people try to get around this is they say, well, it was just a happy accident. Well, what they say is, well, imagine there's many universes, an infinite amount of universes, in fact, that are springing up all the time. So it's no surprise if there's a million universes that one going to have these precise properties that lead to life, and the rest of them don't. If I like to go to Vegas and ask, okay, where are the chances of me walking up to one slot machine, dropping in a quarter, and winning $1 million? Not good, right? But what if I do that in a different universe 7 billion times in a row? Okay. The chances become better for me doing that. Every time I go, the chances are terrible, but enough chances and the impossible suddenly becomes possible. Well, you ask yourself just two questions about that particular question. Number one, even if there is a universe-making machine, some way for new universes to spring into existence all the time, all that really does is back up the question one step. The complexity of our universe and any kind of universe generator would need intelligence to explain it, since even a bread machine needs to be well designed. And number two is that what is the state of the evidence of the multiverse? To put this politely, there's no evidence for the existence of multiple universes. Nor will there ever likely to be, because by definition, another universe can't be observed from inside this one. A really honest scientist is going to admit to you that this is just a metaphysical question. It's on par with proving that God exists. And there's more evidence to prove that God is who he says he is. Excuse me. Excuse me about that. Most honest scientists will tell you that a multiverse is pure metaphysics, which puts it on par with the hypothesis that God exists. But you have to ask, which is more plausible? A random generated universe generator, for which we have no evidence, or a creator who designed everything, who we have all sorts of evidence that he created it? Now, the second part of this design theory, the design question, comes from the complexity of biological organisms. Now, this one's a little hard to explain, but I'm going to do my best, okay? All right, here it goes. So, what we're seeing now is an information revolution in technology that just so happens to come about at the same time as we're finding out that all of biology is not driven by chemistry. You said, what? No, it's not. It's driven by information. It used to be you can imagine that the right chemicals and proteins in a simple cell could simply pop into existence by shuffling the parts. What we now know is that life is driven by information, not chemistry. That's what DNA tells the cells to do. That's what RNA tells the cells to do. One of the scientists driving the intelligent design movement went back and looked at Darwin's mentors. Sir Charles Lyell, who said, look for causes, how in operation, to explain that what you see. And when he realized that at the root of every cell, all life, was information, he asked himself, what is the sole known cause of specified complex information, like the kind we see undergirding every living thing? And the answer, of course, is intelligence. Intelligence drives all of it. Design argument from physics and biology is so powerful that in fact it convinced a leading atheist 6 years ago to convert to Christianity, to convert to theism to begin with, but now he's a believer. And here's the reasons he gave for converting. Number one was his growing compatibility and empathy with the insight of Einstein and other noted scientists that there had to be an intelligence behind the integrated complexity of the physical universe. The second, he says, was his own insight that the integrated complexity of life itself, which is far more complex than the physical universe, can only be explained in terms of an intelligent source. He goes on to say, I believe that the origin of life and reproduction simply cannot be explained from a biological standpoint, despite numerous efforts to do so. With every passing year, the more that was discovered from the richness and inherent intelligence of life, the less it seemed likely that a chemical soup could magically generate the genetic code. The difference between life and non-life, it became apparent to me, was ontological and not chemical. The best confirmation of this radical gulf is Richard Dawkins's comical effort to argue in The God Delusion that the origin of life was just a lucky chance. It is the best argument you have, then the game is over, he says. No, I did not hear a voice. It was the evidence that led me to these conclusions. Okay? Now, the next stream of evidence I want to look at is called first cause. And here's the way it works. The argument goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe has a cause. Therefore, the universe has a beginning. I think I typed that wrong. Everyone from ancient Greek to modern atheists believed that universe was eternal. Consistent with atheism and pantheism it was. They both said matter comes from mind, the universe is all there ever was, God arose out of the material world. Basically, in the beginning, man created God. And ancient Jews looked kind of silly because in the beginning, God created man. However, all this overturned by discovery because of the new, what they call the Big Bang Theory. And you're thinking, what? Okay. Einstein theory suggested an expanding universe. To have a steady state, which is what this used to be called, where the universe was eternal, It had no beginning. It has no end. Matter has always existed. It just was reformed. And the Big Bang, problem with the Big Bang is it creates, it sends you back to find the cause, because it's a causal event. Something caused it. Now, I don't know for a fact that God used the Big Bang to create the universe. He might have. Who knows? God doesn't really spend a lot of time sitting there and telling us, well, this is how I did this, and this is what I put this together, and I did, He didn't give us blueprints for how to build the universe. All he said was what he said in Genesis 1. In the beginning, God, eternal, everlasting, never had a beginning. He's the only one who ever did. Created ex nihilo, in other words, out of nothing. In the beginning, God created. Nobody else could do that. I remember hearing a joke one time about a group of scientists who challenged God to prove that they could create life in the create life. And he said, "Okay, and so God says, I'll show you," and he creates life. And then he says, "Okay, we'll duplicate that." The guy says, "No, wait a minute. You got to start like I did. You got no matter to work with." Because God created it from nothing. It was simply him saying, "Let there be," and it was. Okay. Einstein's theory said the universe is expanding. Therefore, it was beginning. It had a beginning. A beginning, the discovery of beginning sent shockwaves to the scientific community, because the implications of a beginning are clear. If the universe had a beginning, it needs a beginner. It needs a primary cause. And so if we admit there's a cause, why wouldn't it just be a material one? A beginning means space, time, and matter come into existence at that singularity, at that moment. And you can't have a material cause without material. Okay? If time, space, and energy come into existence and had a beginning and are finite, then it's not logical to say that they were caused by something bound by space, time, matter, or energy. How can something operate and create everything? And I mean space, time, matter, and everything, brought it into existence, if it was bound by space, time, matter? Couldn't. In fact, the most likely cause of these things, stands outside of them and is timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and enormously powerful. We use different words, but eternal, omnipresent, spiritual, and omnipotent. You know what, guys? You know who we just described? Who we described as the primary cause of the universe? And you can't deny that. Because if the universe had a beginning, something had to act on it to make it begin. And that primary cause had to be eternal, had to be omnipresent, had to be spiritual, and had to be omnipotent, all-powerful. Guess what? All those describe God. It's who he is. God is eternal. God is everywhere. He's spaceless. He's omnipresent. It says God is spirit. It also says God the Father is spirit. And he's omnipotent. He's all-powerful. Everything inside the universe depends on something else. It flows in a chain of cause and effect, bound by natural law. It is not bound, okay? This means the cause is non-contingent. It means it is not bound by natural law, and it is not dependent on anything else to exist. If something is not bound, it is completely and totally free. So the first cause had a quantity that nothing else in the universe had or has. It's free. It's the only one thing we know of that can act apart from the necessity of natural law, and that's personality. And that means that there's a strong case that to be made that this first cause, the one who is omnipotent and eternal and spiritual, all that is also personal. It means that who we're describing is a personal God who created everything. Robert Jastrow, former agnostic, now a Christian, wrote this. For the scientist, oh, by the way, he's an astronomer, blah, blah, blah. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer its highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he's greeted by a band of theologians worshiping the one true God who have been sitting there for centuries waiting on science to catch up. Do you understand that? You understand what I'm saying? That the scientists are even starting to realize that the creation of the universe required something to act on it from outside the universe. And everything we just described describes God the Father. Our third line is from the area of morality. Now, we kind of talked about it this week, but just to remind you, okay, if morals are not objective, there is not God. Morals are objective, therefore, there is a God. Anyone can say morals are subjective, and lots of people try to say it and defend it, but they expect moral standards. They'll say, well, morals are just subjective. They can be what they want, they're based on, And then you ask them, okay, here's Hitler's plan for Superman. He was based on Nietzsche. Hitler murdered 6 million Jews, 1 million Christians. Most people don't realize that part. All kids who were mentally retarded or blind or deaf were executed by Hitler to create his perfect race. But he would have said there's no moral standards because morals are just something we make up. But ask somebody today if racism is right, and they'll tell you no. Ask an atheist. Hey, back in the 50s we had segregation and we had slavery in the 80s. Is that right? And you'll say no. It's racism. It's evil. But how can it be evil if moral standards don't exist? See, there either has to be moral standards and it has to come from a higher source than us, or it's just based on what we think is moral. It's subjective to what we want. I've only found one person, well, other than Nietzsche and some of the old atheists who argued that mankind needed to be ruthless, and that was the most highest form of humanity, was to be ruthless, and no compassion, no mercy, no pity, but to completely believe in themselves and only themselves and no one else. But let me read you this quote. I found a person from modern times who believes that morals are subjective. Then I learned that all moral judgments are value judgments, that all moral judgments are subjective, and that none can be proved to be either right or wrong. I discovered that to become truly free, truly unfettered, I had to truly become uninhibited. And I quickly discovered that the greatest obstacle to my freedom, the greatest block and limitation to it, consists in the unstoppable value judgment that I was bound to respect the rights of others. Oh, by the way, that gentleman was a guy named Ted Bundy. You may have heard of him. He was a serial killer and a murderer and a rapist. But he was always extremely intelligent. And his logic is right. If morals are subjective, then we don't have to worry about the rights of others. But the bottom line is there's a higher law, and it comes from Jesus Christ. You know, the thing about all this is that all these arguments that we've just talked about, all this stuff we've looked at, they were actually anticipated by Paul. We read one of these, the Romans 1:19 through 20. You know what that says? It says that God has revealed himself in nature. He's revealed his handiwork by how he created. There's fingerprints everywhere. We're his handiwork. His fingerprints are all over us because he created us. A man has to forcibly deny God in order to reject Jesus. He has to ignore the handiwork, come up with his own reasonings to deceive himself. Romans 2:14 through 16 says this: when Gentiles who have not the divine law do instinctively what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, since they do not have the law. They show that the essential requirements of the law are written in their hearts and are operating there, with which their consciences, sense of right and wrong, also bear witness, and their moral decisions, their arguments of reason, their condemning or approving thoughts will accuse or perhaps defend and excuse them. On that day, when as my gospel proclaims, God by Jesus Christ will judge men in regard to the things which they conceal. Look, guys, the reality is that no man is without excuse. And even somebody who has not heard the gospel yet, if he is answering to the revelation he's received, God will bring somebody into his life to share the gospel with him. Now, that all said, doesn't excuse us from not making disciples. Because Matthew 28 says, go in as you are going and make disciples. See, we say, I hear people say, well, what about all the people who've never been reached and they're going to die in their sins and they never had a chance to hear the gospel, and I can't believe God would do that to them. Well, Romans 1:19 says that they're without excuse because God revealed his handiwork to them. And Romans 2:14 through 16 says that if they live by the law, if they seek the revelation, God will give it to them. You don't think God's powerful enough to say, hey, you know what? He's seeking the truth. He really wants to know. I'll bring people into his life. I'll do what it takes to bring that person into my kingdom. Problem is that most of us aren't seeking truth. We're only seeking what tickles our ears, pleases our fancy. Folks, you have to ask yourself if there is a God, and evidence seems to indicate he is. He is there. His fingerprints are everywhere. Did you want to bet that he isn't who he says he is? Do you want to walk away from him and say, oh no, there's all sorts of evidence that he's God, but I'm going to ignore it? That's what Dawkins does. Dawkins even said that even if you could prove emphatically that there is a God, I wouldn't accept it. His faith is in evolution. His faith is in his atheism. Excuse me. So guys, you're thinking, well, thank you, Pastor Mike. We learned a lot tonight, but how does this apply to me in my Christian walk? How do we get to the next step? Well, here's what I want you to understand about all this. Number one, you need to decide what you believe, because what you believe determines what you do. And your faith is based on that. What you truly believe in, you will act on. I've said that before. If I truly believe I can fly, even though I'm wrong, I'll jump off the Empire State Building and float down, right? No, I don't believe I can fly, and I'm not going to attempt it, because I don't really believe it. Now, there are some delusional people out there who believe things that aren't true. But what you believe in affects what you do. And if your world view says that Jesus Christ is at the very center of it, and there is a God, and he did create this universe, then it impacts how you react to the world around you, how you react to the people around you. I was reminding somebody this morning that, they asked me about unchurched people groups and how they could be fair for God not to tell, to God to make sure that he heard them before. And here's truth you need to understand. Number one, God, and we read in Romans 2:14-16, says that I reveal based on what they're seek. If they're looking, if they hold the word, they hold the law in their heart, and they're following what's instinctively built into them, then I will reveal myself to them. I will bring someone into their life so they'll hear the gospel. I got news for you. Even if they die not knowing the name Jesus, if they understand that there is a one God and that he sent his son to die for him, and he rose again, and he accepts him and accepts him, it doesn't matter if he calls him by the right name or not. It only matters that he understands that he's a sinner and he was only saved by God's grace, whether he knows the terms or the language. Because God reveals himself to their hearts. I also know this. If tomorrow I walked out of here and I led one person to Jesus Christ, and I spent 6 months discipling that one person, and at the end of the 6 months, the two of us walked out, and we each won another person to Christ, and we both spent 6 months discipling that person. And at the end of that 6 months, we all four went out and won four more to Christ and spent 6 months. And we doubled every 4 months, geometrically like that. Do you know what? In 17 years, every person on this globe would have heard the gospel of Jesus Christ. We'd be hard-pressed after 17 years to find one person who hadn't heard it. So, believers, if you're not sharing your faith, guess what? You're not being obedient, and you're saying to the world that I hate you. God's fingerprints are everywhere. They're over me, they're all over you.